history, not only history of survival of any group that would come into a place that had nothing. There was nothing here. When they came, when those poor 60 first souls got off the boat and found their way down to Woodbine, there was nothing here. There were trees. There was a little shack by the railroad track. So they had to literally cut the trees and go through and create the town. Now there were specific plans for this community that were arranged through the Baron de Hirsch Fund, which provided the money to bring the immigrants, the Hebrew Immigration Society, which is called Hayas, and the Jewish Agricultural Society. Those groups were dominated by very wealthy New York Jewish businessmen. And they were benevolent enough to put some Philadelphia Jewish businessmen on their board. So these men who were very well established and very wealthy were also into the philanthropy of trying to save their brothers from the persecution and the poverty that they were experiencing, particularly in Russia. But eventually we got Ukrainians, we got Poles, we got lots of Italians, and the Italians and Jews here got along very well, because even to this day they will tell you there's not that much difference between the Italian people and the Jewish people. They both love family, they both love good food. So, you know, there's a lot of urban legend, but a lot of life experience.
Cultural similarities.
That brings that cultural similarity, exactly. So when this community began, it began as an agricultural experiment. The idea was that those original settlers would have a piece of land, a house, which they had to build themselves, a cow, some chickens, and that they would become, quote, of the land. That's what Baron de Hirsch's wish was, that they would no longer be lower than serfdom, but that they now would have the pride and the upward position of being people who developed a farm and created crops and fed their families. Well, they didn't know any more about being a farmer than we do. And plus the land was a mess. Now I've learned that, by the way, that was then, this is now. I've learned through the Rutgers extension of in Cape May Courthouse that you can grow anything in New Jersey. Don't let people tell you because we have red sandy soil we can't produce. That's not true. New Jersey is a wonderful place to grow. But in those days, these people, A, knew nothing about how to be farmers, and B, there were no soil chemists. There was no methodology. So while they were failing as farmers, they were also starving. And what I did was, I made a, could you give Mr. Balicki his copy? I picked about 6 pages out of a very old book that I discovered when I was doing some research that has some oral histories for people actually telling how they ate, how they developed how they built their houses, how they celebrated holidays. And so I made like 6 pages for each of your students, thinking that, you know, if you're, you know what, like when you're bored and like say you go to the throne room and you need 20 minutes to yourself, read it. It's really interesting. And it kind of really tells you in their own words how they managed to recreate the cultures that they left behind, the religious commitments that they left behind, and were able to survive in the new world and eventually prosper. It was very, very hard, but because of those groups that I already mentioned, there was a plan in place also for industrialization. And God forbid if farming didn't work out, they already had the plan lined up that they would put factories here. So that really saved the community, because when the farming was failing, they brought in a wonderful man who became the first mayor. His name was Sapsevich. Accc had come from Russia and was out in Denver, Colorado, teaching at a school. He was a soil chemist. They brought that soil chemist to Woodbine, and through his help and his ability, he started to teach the farmers how to develop the soil so that they could make it productive. And actually, the first agricultural school in New Jersey became the Woodbine Agricultural School. So eventually, Professor Accc and many of his colleagues were able to make the soil productive. But look, there were hard winters, there was nothing to eat, but the little kernels off the sheaves of the wheat. There are stories of how they nearly froze to death, they nearly starved to death. I mean, they had a really hard time in the beginning. But the factories kind of saved things. And the mothers would go to the factories and the fathers would work on the farm, or vice versa. But in any given family, you found that members of that family were working both ends to try to be successful. Their other page I gave you was on education. There were two things beyond survival that were important to them. And one was to educate their children, and two was, one gentleman who is now very elderly told me that he grew up knowing that you had to get a diploma and you had to get a mortgage. You had to be educated and you had to own your home. So they were very, very committed to education, and they started schools almost immediately. And we have a lot of really interesting people, as you do from every community. But since we're in Woodbine and we're talking about Woodbine, there's some really amazing people who grew up here. And this board right here that is just a very small example, and Ornette and I are working on getting more people up here. But let me just take Jacob Lippman for an example. He was a soil chemist. Jacob Lippman and Gregory Pincus, by the way, were first cousins. They weren't born in Woodbine, but they came here with their parents when they were very small. Why did their parents come? For employment. They heard about the farms here were much more productive by the time they came, which would have been, by the way, after 1900. You know, from 1891 when this community began until 1899, they had this period of development. So then more and more people were coming. So these kids came as little boys. Ironically, though, besides the fact that they were first cousins, this fellow, what a phenomenon. He became a soil chemist, and in reading his biography, I learned that he and his students, say this is your professor and you're his students, and in their labs, they discovered, help me, Ornette, streptomycin. They discovered the first strains of what would eventually become a healing method in medicine. They had it like 12 years in the process, and they used it through their chemistry labs. They discovered it through trying to improve the soil. And when you find out what these soil chemists have done to create an environment where we could actually have productive farms, it's remarkable. I mean, you could almost want to do a thesis on it. Very, very fascinating. So little Jacob Lippman grew up, and he became the head of his department at Rutgers. And I know when I first moved to New Jersey back in the 70s, because I was a Pennsylvania girl, I wanted to grow tomato plants because, you know, there's always this rivalry between who has the better tomatoes, who has the better corn. My mother always said Pennsylvania was better. So I went to a little farmer's market and I asked an old gentleman, "Sir, what kind of tomato plants should I get?" And he said, "Rutgers." And I'm sorry, he said, Rutgers. Rutgers. The Rutgers tomato. Him, wow. Jacob Lippman, developed the Rutgers tomato. And that's like one of the best Jersey tomatoes there is. You know, people know, Jersey tomato. Now, Gregory, his cousin, yeah, women should be very happy with Gregory Pincus, because Gregory Pincus was a protege of Margaret Sanger, who was the woman who pushed and pushed and pushed until eventually she and he and other professionals who worked together developed progesterone and invented the birth control pill. So women can be very grateful, I think maybe today. Now, if you're a feminist, you hate them. But
Jane, you're right from our book. That's it.
And I know women.
Coming to all these terms.
And I know women that hated him. But it's very fascinating, nonetheless, that he grew up in Woodbine and went to Millville High School. Amen. So these are just two examples. I mean, gosh, the Italian-American community gets representation in Henry DeSink. DeSink is an Italian name. And he developed the Woodbine Airport. Now, that Woodbine Airport, during World War II, was a place where they trained pilots to take off and land on the big transport ships. And who know that little old Woodbine Airport will play such an important role in the war. And in addition to that, the factories here manufactured uniforms for both World War I and World War II and Korea. But by the time the 50s came along, things had changed here dramatically. The socioeconomic curve just went. And most of the Jewish population, the second generation, educated their children and moved on. And if they didn't move on, the third generation absolutely moved on. So today we have visitors from almost every state, I swear to God, almost every state in the Union, and foreign countries who, if you say the word Woodbine, Woodbine, well, I have a story for you, or I have a relative, or, you know, like Ornette just looked at the sign-in book from Sunday, and somebody was here from South Korea. But we had somebody here from Saudi Arabia a couple months ago, but she was the daughter of one of the original settlers' daughters. But she lives in Saudi Arabia now. But she came home and had to come to Woodbine because it's like that pull that you have on, particularly as you grow more mature in life, there's a pull on many people to want to reconnect to their roots, and they want to know more about what they came from, where they came from. And people come here, many, many older people who have Woodbine connections come here primarily for that reason.
You mentioned the terrible times for the farmers not having much food, the winters being very bleak.
Yeah.
What was the role of the church at that time?
Well, I put a page in there about that because we had, there were churches, but the history that I have is about the synagogue. And what they did was they created a benevolent association, and they found ways, they found ways to bring food and money to the people who were so desperate. And say, for instance, if there were some crops that were semi-successful, but people didn't, they would walk, say, to Dennisville. Like if you know Seaville, they would walk to Dennisville. And by the way, that's the reason that they built a mikveh. A mikveh is basically a big public bath. In the cities, they used to call them the schwitz. And in Russia, very, very popular to go to the public bath. And it's kind of like going to a sauna and getting beaten with those bamboo sticks, and you're supposed to be so healthy. They built a public bath because the poor, dumb farmers that worked so hard to get the stuff, they couldn't sell it. There was no one to sell it to, so they would walk. And they used to walk to Dennisville, and the people in Dennisville called them those dirty Jews. Well, they were dirty, and they smelled bad because they didn't have inside bathrooms, and they didn't have